Relax, he said, not even looking up. She's just a waitress. The laughter came easy, soft at first, then louder as crystal glasses clinked against polished marble, the kind of laughter that never questioned itself, the kind that assumed it was always right. Emily Carter stood still beside the table, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her posture calm, almost weightless, as if the room's judgment passed through her without leaving a mark. She didn't react. Not to the laughter, not to the tone, not even to the way Jonathan Reed's voice carried just enough amusement to make everyone else follow. Instead, she watched. Quietly, carefully. The private dining room stretched wide with glass walls overlooking the Manhattan skyline, city lights flickering like distant signals in the night. But inside, the real power sat around a single table. 12 executives, $1 billion deal, and a waitress no one bothered to notice. Or so they thought. Emily moved forward, placing a glass of sparkling water beside a man in a navy suit who was speaking too quickly, his words slightly rushed, like someone trying to sound more confident than he felt. She caught a number, then another, a percentage that didn't align. Her fingers tightened, just slightly, against the edge of the tray. No one else seemed to notice. Of course they didn't. They were too busy performing certainty. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his Swiss watch catching the light as he tapped the table once, signaling the room to settle. He was in control. He was always in control. "We finalized tonight," he said, his tone smooth, unquestioned. No more delays. Heads nodded instantly. Agreement came fast when power was clear. Emily stepped closer, setting down a small plate, her movements precise, almost silent. She glanced once more at the documents spread across the table. The numbers were still wrong. Not slightly. Not debatably. Completely. She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Excuse me, sir." The room paused, not in respect, but in irritation, like a background noise interrupting something important. Jonathan didn't even turn his head at first. "Yes," he said, distracted, already expecting something trivial. Emily met his gaze. Calm. Unshaken. "The figure on page 3, she said gently. "It doesn't match the projected return on page 7. Silence followed. Not the kind that listens. The kind that judges. Then someone chuckled. Another joined. Jonathan finally looked at her fully, a faint smile forming, the kind that carried more dismissal than humor. "And you noticed that?" he asked, his tone light, almost entertained. "Unless you have an MBA," he added, leaning forward slightly. "I'd suggest you focus on the menu." The laughter returned. Louder this time. Sharper. But Emily didn't smile. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something invisible to everyone else, then placed the check neatly on the table. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, and for a brief moment, her pen hovered over the paper. Then she wrote something. Just one line. Small. Easy to miss. She stepped back. "Of course," she said softly. Jonathan dismissed her with a glance, already turning back to his board, already certain the moment had passed. But as Emily walked away, her expression remained unchanged. Calm. Observing. As if she hadn't just been corrected, but had simply finished her work. And behind her, on a table filled with confidence, signatures, and certainty, one small line of ink waited. Unnoticed. For now. Jonathan Reed did not look at the check when it was placed in front of him. He rarely did. Numbers, signatures, totals, they all existed in a world beneath his attention, handled by assistants, confirmed by systems, approved without friction. His focus stayed on the board, on the voices that echoed confidence back to him, on the deal that was already, in his mind, complete. "We move forward," he said again, sealing the tone of the evening. Around him, heads nodded in practiced rhythm, each agreement reinforcing the illusion of certainty. No one questioned. No one paused. Outside, the city continued to glow, but inside, the room felt sealed, insulated from doubt. In the distance, Emily moved between tables, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, as if nothing significant had happened. But her absence from the table left something behind. Something small, something quiet, and still unnoticed. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Final remarks. Polished reassurances. Subtle competition disguised as collaboration. Then chairs shifted. Jackets were adjusted. Phones reappeared. The performance was over. Jonathan stood, straightening his cufflinks, his reflection briefly catching in the dark glass behind him. Everything was aligned. Everything was under control. He reached for the check without looking, flipping it open with the same casual motion he had done 1,000 times before. His pen hovered, then paused, just slightly. A line of ink written beneath the total. Small, precise, unexpected. His eyes narrowed. The room faded for a moment, voices dissolving into background noise as the words settled into focus. A formula, not complete, but enough. A correction, a discrepancy, a number that should not exist. Jonathan did not move. He read it once, then again, slower this time. The air shifted, almost imperceptibly. "What is it?" one of the board members asked, noticing the change in his stillness. Jonathan did not answer. Instead, he pulled the folder from the table, flipping to page 3. His movements were no longer casual. They were exact, controlled, intentional. Page 7 followed. His finger traced the figures, aligning them with the handwritten note, reconstructing the path that no one else had seen. Silence grew. This time, it was different. Not dismissive, not careless. It carried weight. "That is not possible," someone muttered, too quickly, too defensively. Jonathan's gaze lifted. Slowly, one by one, he looked at each person at the table. No anger. Not yet. Just something colder. Calculation. "Explain it," he said quietly, placing the paper flat against the table. The number sat there, undeniable. The room hesitated. Eyes shifted. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat, reaching for an answer that did not come. "It must be a rounding issue," he offered, the words already sounding uncertain as they left his mouth. Jonathan said nothing. He turned back to the documents, running the calculation again, this time in silence. The result did not change. It could not change, because it was not a rounding error. It was a structural flaw, a hidden gap that had been overlooked, repeated, approved, signed. The kind of mistake that did not happen by accident. The kind that cost more than money. Jonathan closed the folder. Gently, too gently. The sound barely registered, but the shift in the room was immediate. Something had broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. "Who reviewed this?" he asked. No one answered right away. And in that hesitation, the truth began to surface. Not in words, in silence. The kind of silence that revealed more than any explanation ever could. Across the room, unnoticed, Emily placed another glass on a different table, her eyes briefly lifting toward the private dining room before returning to her work. Calm, unchanged, as if she already knew what would happen next. No one spoke, not because they did not have answers, but because every answer now felt dangerous. Jonathan Reed remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, the other still holding the check with that single handwritten line. His eyes moved again across the room, slower this time, as if he were seeing each person not as a title or a role, but as a variable that no longer added up. "I asked a question," he said, his voice calm, almost quiet, yet it carried further than before, cutting through the air with precision. The man in the gray suit shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie as if the gesture could restore his confidence. "The projections were reviewed by the entire team," he replied, choosing his words carefully, as if distance from responsibility could protect him. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "The entire team," he repeated, not as agreement, but as confirmation of something else. His gaze dropped briefly to the documents, then back up again. "So 12 people reviewed this," he continued, his tone unchanged, and a waitress corrected it in less than 30 seconds. The words landed harder than any raised voice could have. A silence followed that no one tried to break this time. It was no longer a pause. It was exposure. One of the executives leaned forward, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "With all due respect," he began, forcing a polite tone, "we do not know where that note came from or whether it is even accurate. It could be coincidental." Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone, tapping the screen with deliberate precision, pulling up a financial model. Numbers appeared. Clean, structured, unforgiving. He entered the correction exactly as it had been written. No interpretation, no adjustment, just replication. The result recalculated instantly. The screen reflected in his eyes for a brief moment before he turned it outward, placing it flat on the table for everyone to see. The number changed. Significantly. Not a minor deviation. Not a rounding error. A shift large enough to alter the entire foundation of the deal. No one spoke. Again. But this time, the silence felt heavier, like the room itself had acknowledged the truth before anyone could deny it. Jonathan stepped back from the table, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that made the tension sharper. 6 months, he said, almost to himself, though everyone heard it clearly. 6 months of analysis, reviews, meetings, and this is what you approved. No accusation, no anger, just a statement. And somehow, that made it worse. The man in the navy suit opened his mouth, then closed it again. Another looked down at the table, avoiding eye contact entirely. The structure that had supported their authority began to collapse, not outwardly, but internally, where confidence used to exist. Jonathan picked up the folder once more, then let it fall back onto the table with a soft, controlled motion. Do you know what the most expensive mistake is? He asked, his eyes moving across them one last time. No one answered. He nodded slightly, as if he had expected that. It is not the one you make, he said quietly. It is the one you do not see. The words settled into the room, filling the space where certainty used to live. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he added, "You are all dismissed." At first, no one moved. Not because they did not understand, but because they did. Completely. Chairs remained still. Hands froze mid-motion. The weight of the sentence took a moment to fully arrive. Jonathan did not repeat himself. He did not need to. He simply turned away, his attention already shifting elsewhere, as if the decision had been made long before this moment, and this was only its confirmation. One by one they stood, slowly, quietly, not with the confidence they had entered with, but with something else entirely. And in the reflection of the glass walls, the most powerful people in the room no longer looked powerful at all. Across the restaurant floor, Emily continued her work, placing a plate, adjusting a glass, her movement steady, untouched by the shift that had just changed everything. She did not look back. She did not need to. Some things, once seen, did not require witnessing again. The room did not recover after they left. It only emptied. One by one, the men who had once filled it with certainty disappeared through the glass doors, their reflections fading into the city lights beyond, leaving behind nothing but silence and a table covered in untouched confidence. Jonathan Reed remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the documents for a moment longer, not as a man surprised, but as a man recalibrating. Then, slowly, he exhaled. Not frustration, not relief, just clarity. He picked up the check again, his eyes returning to that single line of handwriting, the ink still fresh enough to feel intentional, precise, deliberate. It was not just correct. It was efficient. No excess, no explanation, just the truth, reduced to its simplest form. He turned slightly, looking through the glass wall into the main dining area. The noise of the restaurant returned gradually. Distant conversations, the soft rhythm of silverware, the low hum of a city that never paused. And there she was, Emily Carter, moving between tables with the same quiet consistency, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if nothing in her world had shifted at all. No sign of recognition, no expectation, no attempt to be noticed. Jonathan watched her for a few seconds longer than necessary, then a few more. Something about the stillness in her movements contrasted too sharply with everything that had just happened. It did not make sense. People who disrupted systems usually carried it with them, some trace of urgency, of pride, of reaction. She carried none of it. She placed a glass of water for an elderly couple, nodded once as they thanked her, and stepped away without waiting for acknowledgement. Efficient, focused, present, as if the moment in the private room had never existed. Jonathan adjusted his cuff slightly, a small habit when his thoughts aligned into decision. Then he moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just directly. He stepped out of the private dining room and into the main floor, his presence immediately shifting the subtle awareness of the space. A few heads turned, not because he demanded attention, but because he naturally carried it. But he ignored them. His focus remained fixed ahead. Emily was just finishing at a table when she noticed him approaching. Her eyes lifted briefly, meeting his, not with surprise, not with concern, but with simple acknowledgement. Professional. Calm. Is everything satisfactory, sir? She asked, her tone even, as if he were any other customer. Jonathan stopped in front of her. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply observed, as if confirming something that logic alone could not explain. Up close, nothing about her suggested what had just happened. No visible tension, no hidden urgency, just composure. The kind that did not come from practice, but from certainty. You wrote this, he said finally, holding up the check between two fingers. Not a question, a statement. Emily glanced at it for less than a second, then back at him. Yes, she replied. No hesitation, no embellishment, just the answer. Jonathan studied her expression, searching for something more. Explanation, justification, something that would fit into the framework he understood. He found none. Do you understand what that number represents? He asked, his voice quieter now, not challenging, but precise. Emily tilted her head slightly, as if considering the simplest way to respond. A mistake, she said. Then, after a brief pause, she added, one that repeats. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, in recognition. And you saw it in 30 seconds, he said. Emily shook her head, just once. Less, she replied softly. The answer did not carry pride. It carried fact. Around them, the restaurant continued, unaware that the balance of power had shifted just a few feet away. Jonathan lowered the check slowly, his gaze never leaving her. For the first time that night, he was not looking at a role, not a uniform, not a position. He was looking at a mind. And for the first time in a long time, he realized something unexpected. He had not been the one in control of the moment. He had only been the one who noticed it last. Jonathan did not look away, not when she answered, not when she stood there with the same quiet certainty that had already dismantled an entire boardroom. There was no performance in her tone, no attempt to impress, no effort to explain beyond what was necessary. And somehow, that made every word land heavier. Less, he repeated, almost under his breath, as if testing the weight of it. 30 seconds would have been impressive. Less than that felt intentional, designed. You are not just a waitress, he said, finally. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. Emily did not react to it. She simply adjusted the position of a glass on the table beside her, aligning it perfectly with the edge, her movements precise, almost methodical. I am exactly what I need to be right now, she replied. Jonathan studied her for a moment longer, trying to map her response into something familiar, something predictable. But it did not fit. Most people, when confronted, revealed something. Ambition, fear, excitement. She revealed none of it. Only control. Where did you learn to see that? He asked, holding up the check again. This time not as evidence, but as a question. Emily glanced at the paper, then back at him. The same place everyone else did, she said softly. Then she added, I just paid attention. The answer was simple. Too simple. And yet, it explained everything. Jonathan's expression shifted, not outwardly, but in the subtle way his shoulders relaxed, as if a realization had settled into place. Around them, a server passed by carrying a tray, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continuing uninterrupted, but the space between them felt separate now, insulated from the noise. 12 executives, Jonathan said slowly, almost to himself, and none of them saw it. Emily did not respond. She did not need to. The truth had already been spoken. He looked down at the check once more, then folded it carefully, not out of habit, but with intention, as if preserving something valuable. Do you know what they cost me? He asked, his voice steady, his eyes lifting to meet hers again. Emily considered the question for a brief moment, her expression unchanged. More than they should have, she answered. Jonathan almost smiled. Not because it was amusing, but because it was accurate. And you? He asked. What do you cost? This time, Emily paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if deciding whether the question deserved an answer. Her gaze remained steady, meeting his without challenge, without submission. That depends, she said quietly, on whether you are paying for time or for truth. The words settled between them, sharp in their simplicity. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of something unfamiliar crossing his expression. Respect. Not given lightly. Not given often. Come with me, he said, his tone shifting, No longer dismissive, no longer casual, but direct. I want to understand how you saw it. Emily did not move immediately. She glanced toward the other tables, toward the responsibilities that still existed around her, the world that had not paused just because something significant had happened. I am working, she replied, not as refusal, as fact. Jonathan followed her gaze, then nodded once, acknowledging the boundary without argument. Then I will wait, he said simply. No negotiation. No assumption that his time was more valuable than hers. Just a statement. For a moment, nothing else was said. Emily picked up her tray again, her movements returning to their steady rhythm. But something had shifted, not in her posture, but in the space around her. Jonathan stepped back slightly, giving her room, yet his presence remained, not as authority, but as attention. And for the first time that night, the balance between them was no longer defined by titles, or wealth, or position. It was defined by something far quieter, the ability to see what others missed, and the willingness to acknowledge it. Jonathan did not leave. Not when she turned away. Not when the rhythm of the restaurant resumed around him as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. He simply stepped aside, positioning himself just beyond the flow of movement, his presence quiet now, no longer commanding the room, but observing it. Waiting. For the first time in years, he was not measuring time in dollars or decisions, but in moments he could not control. Emily moved from table to table with the same steady precision, her attention divided yet complete, never rushed, never distracted. She listened when customers spoke. She adjusted details others overlooked. A fork slightly out of place. A glass not filled to the exact level. Small things. Invisible things. Jonathan watched it all, his expression thoughtful, as if the answer he was looking for had already been in front of him long before tonight. A man in his position was used to patterns, market trends, behavioral models, predictable outcomes. But this was different. This was not strategy. It was awareness. And awareness did not announce itself. It simply existed, unnoticed, until someone paid attention. Nearly 15 minutes passed before Emily returned to his table. Not rushed. Not delayed. Exactly when she intended to. Thank you for waiting, she said, her tone unchanged, as if he had been any other guest. Jonathan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without correcting it. Walk with me, he said, this time softer, less directive, more like a request than an order. Emily glanced briefly toward the manager's station, then back at him. A subtle calculation. Responsibility balanced against curiosity. Then she nodded once. Together, they moved toward the quieter side of the restaurant, near the glass wall where the city stretched endlessly beyond them, lights reflecting like distant equations waiting to be solved. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was intentional. Jonathan rested his hand lightly against the edge of the table beside them, his posture relaxed, but his focus sharp. You said it repeats, he began, referring to the mistake. Emily leaned slightly against the wall, her arms at her sides, her stance calm, grounded. Most mistakes do, she replied. People just stop looking after the first confirmation. Jonathan considered that, his gaze drifting briefly to the skyline before returning to her. And you never stopped, he said. Again, not a question. Emily shook her head once. I never assumed it was correct, she answered. There is a difference. The distinction was simple, but it carried weight. Jonathan let the words settle, recognizing the gap between assumption and verification, between confidence and truth. What were you before this? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Emily did not respond immediately, not because she was hiding something, but because she was deciding how much mattered. Finally, she spoke. Someone who asked the same questions, she said. In a different room. Jonathan almost smiled again, but this time it stayed beneath the surface. And now you carry plates instead of reports, he said. Emily's gaze remained steady. Now I listen more, she replied. The answer shifted something. Not in the room. In him. Jonathan straightened slightly, his expression more defined now, as if a decision had begun to form. You saw something 12 people missed, he said. You corrected it without being asked. And you did it without needing credit. Emily did not respond. Because there was nothing to add. That is not common, he continued. That is not accidental. The city lights flickered behind them, reflections shifting across the glass like moving data points, but neither of them looked away. I do not hire resumes, Jonathan said slowly. I hire patterns. A pause. Then, quieter, more precise. And you are a pattern I cannot ignore. Emily held his gaze, not surprised, not flattered, simply present in the moment as it unfolded. Patterns change, she said, if you watch them long enough. Jonathan nodded. Slightly. Then I will keep watching, he replied. The words were simple, but they carried intent. And for the first time, the conversation was no longer about a mistake, or a boardroom, or a single line of ink. It was about something deeper. The recognition of value where no one else had thought to look, and the understanding that sometimes, the most important decisions did not happen in meetings. They happened in moments no one planned for. Jonathan did not speak immediately after her last sentence. Patterns change. The words stayed with him longer than he expected, echoing quietly beneath the surface of his thoughts, not as resistance, but as recognition. He had built an empire on patterns, on predicting movement, on trusting repetition. But he had also watched those same patterns fail when people stopped questioning them. He turned slightly, looking out at the city again, the grid of lights stretching for miles, each one representing decisions, assumptions, systems in motion. Most people wait to be asked, he said finally, his voice low, measured. You did not. Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. Most people are waiting for permission, she replied. I was not. The distinction settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Jonathan shifted his weight slightly, his mind already moving beyond the moment, connecting what he had seen to what it meant. Not just tonight, not just one error, something larger, something structural. If I had not looked at that check, he said, turning back toward her, what would you have done? It was a different kind of question, not about ability, about intention. Emily considered it briefly. Nothing, she answered. Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity. Nothing, he repeated. She nodded once. It was not my decision to make, she said. I corrected what I saw. What you do with it is yours. The answer was simple, clean, without attachment. And that, more than anything, shifted something in him. No need for credit. No need for control. Just accuracy. Jonathan let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, as if releasing a weight he had not realized he was carrying. You understand what you prevented, he said. Emily's expression did not change. Yes, she replied. And you walked away from it, he continued. Just like that. Emily glanced briefly toward the dining floor, where another table had just been seated, then back at him. I did my job, she said. Not defensive, not proud, just precise. Jonathan studied her for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, as if confirming something internally. Your job, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Then, after a pause, he added, you are doing the wrong one. The words were not harsh. They were direct. Emily did not react immediately. She did not challenge it. She simply let the statement exist, as if weighing whether it held value. Or, she said after a moment, I am exactly where I need to be. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus. People say that when they are comfortable, he said. Or when they are patient, she replied. The correction was subtle, but it mattered. For a moment, neither spoke. The city reflected behind them, shifting in the glass, but the space between them remained still. Then Jonathan straightened slightly, his posture aligning with decision. Not impulsive, not reactive, calculated, but different this time. Come in tomorrow, he said. 9 o'clock. My office. There was no build-up, no negotiation, just clarity. Emily did not answer right away. She looked at him, not with hesitation, but with evaluation, as if measuring the offer not by what it sounded like, but by what it meant. Why? She asked. A single word. Direct. Jonathan did not seem surprised by it. If anything, he expected it. Because you see what others miss, he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, and I need people who are not waiting to be asked. Emily held his gaze, steady, unshaken, the same quiet presence that had started everything. Around them, the restaurant continued, unaware that a different kind of decision was being made, one that did not involve contracts or signatures, but something far more rare. Recognition. She exhaled softly, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement of the moment. Then she gave a small nod. Not agreement. Not yet. Just understanding. And Jonathan, for the first time that night, did not push further. Because some answers, he realized, did not come faster just because you were used to getting them. The night did not change after that conversation. It simply continued. Plates were served. Glasses were refilled. Conversations rose and fell in soft waves across the restaurant floor. And yet, something beneath the surface had shifted, quiet and irreversible. Jonathan Reed left without another word, his departure unnoticed by most, just another well-dressed figure stepping into the Manhattan night. But his mind did not leave with him. It stayed, replaying a single line of ink, a single voice that had not tried to be heard, and a presence that had not needed to prove itself. Emily Carter finished her shift the same way she started it. Calm, precise, unhurried. She wiped down the last table, aligning the edges, resetting the space as if preparing it for someone who would never know what had happened there. The manager thanked her. A coworker joked about a long night. She smiled politely, nodded, and moved on. No mention of the private room. No mention of the conversation. Just the quiet routine of someone who did not measure her value by who noticed. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the steady rhythm of a city that never paused for individual moments. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her pace steady as she moved away from the glow of the restaurant. Behind her, glass doors closed softly, sealing the world she had just left. For a moment, she stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change. Cars passed in a blur of headlights. People moved around her, each carrying their own thoughts, their own destinations. She did not rush. She never did. Across the city, high above the streets, Jonathan stood alone in his office, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor to ceiling windows. The building was quiet at this hour. Empty. Controlled. He placed the folder on his desk, then unfolded the check once more, smoothing it flat with deliberate care. The ink had not faded. The line was still there. Clear. Certain. He looked at it longer this time, not searching for error, but understanding its simplicity. One line. No explanation. No need. He walked toward the window, the reflection of the city merging with his own, two patterns overlapping, one predictable, one no longer certain. Patterns change, he repeated quietly, the words no longer abstract, but real. He turned back toward his desk, his hand resting briefly on the polished surface, his posture shifting from reflection to decision. The next morning would not be routine. Not anymore. Back on the street, the light turned green. Emily crossed, her steps measured, blending into the movement of the city without resistance. No one looked at her twice. No one needed to. She was not trying to be seen. She never had been. But somewhere above, in a building filled with power and decisions, someone had finally noticed. And that was enough to change the direction of something far larger than a single night. Not because she asked for it, not because she chased it, but because she saw something others did not. And in a world built on assumptions, that was the one thing that could not be ignored. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No announcement. No dramatic shift in the rhythm of the city. Just light filtering through glass, traffic building below, and decisions waiting to be made. At exactly 9 o'clock, Jonathan Reed stood in his office, already still, already prepared, not for a meeting, but for something he could not fully predict. His desk was clear. No assistants. No interruptions. Just the check, placed neatly at the corner, the single line of ink still visible, still precise. The door remained closed. For now, down below, the city moved as it always did, unaware that one of its smallest, quietest moments was about to step into one of its most controlled spaces. Emily Carter arrived 5 minutes early, not to impress, just because she always did. She paused briefly outside the building, her reflection faint in the polished glass, her posture steady, her expression unchanged from the night before. Then she stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, filled with the low hum of morning activity, polished floors, measured voices, people who moved with purpose. Some glanced at her. Most did not. She did not belong to this world. At least, not visibly. She approached the front desk, gave a name, and waited. No urgency. No expectation. Just presence. Moments later, she was guided to the elevator, the doors closing softly behind her, carrying her upward through floors of decisions, deals, and assumptions. Inside the office, Jonathan did not check the time. He did not need to. He sensed it. The shift. The arrival of something that did not follow his usual patterns. When the door finally opened, he did not speak immediately. He simply looked. Emily stepped inside, her movements calm, her gaze steady, taking in the space without reaction, without awe, without resistance. Just observation. The door closed behind her. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just clear. Jonathan gestured toward the chair across from him. "You came," he said. A simple statement. Emily nodded once as she took the seat, her posture upright, composed. "You asked," she replied. Again, no excess, no performance. Jonathan allowed a brief pause, letting the moment settle before he reached for the check and placed it between them. "This," he said, tapping the paper lightly, "changed a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Emily glanced at it, then back at him. "No," she said quietly. Jonathan's brow shifted slightly. "No," he repeated. She shook her head once. "It revealed a mistake," she corrected. The decision was already wrong. The distinction was subtle, but it reframed everything. Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying her with a new level of attention, not searching for confirmation, but for alignment. "And if no one had seen it?" he asked. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Then the mistake would have continued," she answered. "Like most do." Silence followed again, heavier this time, not because something was missing, but because something had been understood. Jonathan nodded slowly, the movement small, but deliberate. Then he leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the desk, his voice steady, precise. "I offered you a position last night," he said, "but that was not accurate." Emily did not respond. She simply listened. "I am not offering you a job," he continued. "I am offering you a place where your attention matters." The words settled in the room, quiet, controlled, intentional. Emily considered them, not with excitement, not with hesitation, but with clarity. "And if I say no?" she asked. Jonathan did not hesitate. "Then nothing changes," he said. "You return to your work, and I return to mine." A pause. Then, softer, more honest. "But I would know I ignored something important." The honesty was rare, not polished, not strategic, just real. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked briefly at the city beyond the glass, the movement, the patterns, the repetition. Then back at him. "I do not work for titles," she said. "Good," Jonathan replied. "Neither do I." Another pause. Then, finally, she nodded. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just once. A decision made without noise. Jonathan did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply reached for the check, folded it once more, and placed it in a drawer. Not as a record of a mistake, but as a reminder of a moment. Because sometimes, the most important change does not come from power. It comes from the moment someone chooses to see what everyone else ignored. And once seen, it cannot be unseen.